600 bales of cotton gin waste sat behind the old Belmont Spinning Works for 11 weeks after the plant closed. And in that time, the county extension office estimated that roughly nobody had inquired about them. The bales were stacked 3 high along the east fence line, wrapped in orange polypropylene netting, covered at the fiber ends with a chalky gray film where the morning dew had dried and dried again. They smelled faintly of machine oil and something older, dust, maybe, or the particular kind of tire that a building carries when it's been running the same process for 54 years. The liquidating agent, a man named Roy Pickett, who drove down from Statesville once a week to check on the property, had tried twice to donate them to a local nursery. The nursery had declined. He had asked Gaston County if they wanted them for landfill cover. The county said they would look into it, which in Gaston County, North Carolina, in the spring of 2019, meant exactly the same thing it means everywhere else. Nobody came for those bales. 11 weeks. Not a single serious inquiry. And then a 16-year-old girl showed up in her father's Ford F-150 with a legal pad and a tape measure. And the story stopped being simple. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second and subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. Gaston County sits in the western Piedmont of North Carolina, below the Blue Ridge foothills and above the South Carolina line, and for most of the 20th century it ran on textiles. Cotton mills, yarn mills, spinning works. At one point, Gaston County had more textile jobs per capita than almost any county in the country, and by 2019 it still had the infrastructure of that era. The brick buildings, the rail spurs, the wide loading docks, and most of the industry that had filled them was long gone. The Belmont Spinning Works had closed in January. 47 employees on their last day. A holding company out of Charlotte deciding it was no longer cost-effective to run a single-site operation against overseas prices. The plant sat on Elm Street, just off US 29, the main artery through Belmont, and the 600 bales behind it were not technically the mill's problem anymore. They had been on the books as a liability, a disposal cost of roughly $1,100 if the county hauled them, and when the plant transferred to liquidation, Roy Pickett's job was to turn liabilities into something smaller than liabilities. The bales contained gin motes, the short staple cotton fiber left over after the longer lint had been pulled away during ginning. Not trash, exactly, not useful, apparently, just fiber too short to spin commercially in a facility like Belmont Spinning, which had been running ring-frame equipment calibrated for longer staple lengths. The mill had accumulated them over 2 full seasons before it folded. Each bale was roughly the size of a porch chest, and they had been sitting in the Carolina spring air since October. Bev Sorrells, who had run the Gaston County Cooperative Extension Office for 16 years, knew what gin motes were. She had not thought about them in those terms in a long time. When Amber Raines walked into her office on a Tuesday in late April and asked if she knew who owned the bales behind Belmont Spinning, Bev took her reading glasses off and set them on her desk deliberately, the way a person does when they need a moment to figure out what kind of question is actually being asked. "Those old fiber bales?" Bev said. "Yes, ma'am," Amber said. Bev gave her Roy Pickett's number and didn't ask why. Amber Raines was not what most people would call a likely candidate for anything involving legal paperwork or a negotiation with an industrial liquidator. She was the second of 3 children on a 38-acre property in Cramerton, about 4 miles from the mill, where her father ran a small beef operation, 12 Angus cows, a few seasonal calves, and a long-standing arrangement with a neighbor who baled hay in exchange for grazing access. The family was not poor in the way that word tends to get used carelessly. They had land. They had a working truck. What they did not have was much space between where they were and where things could go badly, and Amber had understood that about their situation since she was roughly 12 years old. She called Roy Pickett that Tuesday evening. He answered on the third ring, sounding like a man who had been expecting a call about something else entirely. She told him she was interested in the fiber bales behind Belmont Spinning. He asked what she intended to do with them. She said she had a few ideas. There was a pause, not a long one. Roy Pickett, being a practical man who managed his skepticism efficiently, and he told her that the bales were being evaluated for several potential buyers, which may or may not have been accurate, and that he would note her interest. He did not ask her age. He would discover that later, when she arrived in person, and the adjustment his face made in that moment was what you would expect from a man who had spent 22 years moving industrial assets and had never once had the conversation he was about to have. She drove to the mill site on Thursday after school, arriving at 4:20 in the afternoon in the F-150, with the legal pad and a tape measure. Roy Pickett was waiting by his Silverado with his arms loosely folded, and then Amber climbed out, and he did a small recalibration of his expression that he probably wasn't aware of doing. Not a smirk. Not quite that. Just a slight settling of the jaw that said he had already, somewhere in the back of his mind, categorized this. "You're the one who called," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. He was not a cruel man. He was just a man who had seen a great number of decisions that didn't work out, and he had a practiced look for those moments. He walked her down the length of the bale rows with the approximate energy of a man who has already lost interest in a sales pitch. He explained, not unkindly, that the bales were gin motes, short staple waste fiber, unsuitable for commercial spinning, which was why the mill had been storing them rather than running them. The fiber was mostly half-inch staple and shorter. It fouled a ring frame and cost more to clean than it yielded. Some bales had moisture penetration on the bottom rows. He estimated they were worth somewhere between nothing and $75 per bale to a specialty buyer, and in 11 weeks he had not located a specialty buyer. 600 bales at $75 was $45,000. He had not found interest at that price. He had not found interest at $30. The nursery he'd approached had offered $400 for the lot, which he'd declined because the disposal cost alone, if it came to that, was over $1,100. Amber walked the rows slowly. She crouched down at 2 different points and worked her fingers through the netting of a top row bale and then a bottom row bale. She pulled small tufts loose and held them to the late afternoon light. She pressed the bottom bale with her palm and felt for moisture. She made notes on her legal pad. She did not explain what she was noting. Roy watched her do this with the expression of a man waiting for something to make sense. "Most of it's dry," she said, when she got to the moisture question. "The east side bottom layer has some penetration, but nothing that's gone to rot." "Right," Roy said. She wrote something down and said she'd be in touch by Monday. She came back that Saturday with a mason jar, a postal scale, and her younger brother Marcus, who was 13 and had been recruited under the promise of gas station food on the drive home. She spent 2.5 hours sampling 14 different bales, cutting small portions with a folding knife, weighing each on the scale, sealing them in labeled bags. She noted color, which varied across the rows, lighter on the newer bales and darker on the older ones. She checked fiber length against a card she'd made at home with pencil marks at 1/4-inch intervals. Marcus sat on a concrete block and ate chips and asked periodically when they were leaving. There was one other person at the mill site that Saturday. An older woman named Dora Hensley, 71 years old, from the west side of Belmont, who had worked in the spinning room at Belmont Spinning for 31 years before early retirement in 2012. She still walked past the building on her afternoon rounds because some habits don't know they're finished. She saw the girl and the boy at the bale rose from the sidewalk and stopped. She watched Amber work through her sampling process for a full 4 minutes before she crossed over. "You testing the staple?" Dora said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the moisture profile. Whose girl are you?" "Raymond Raines's daughter. From Cramerton." Dora was quiet a moment. "Your daddy doesn't run cotton." "No, ma'am." "But my grandmother did." Dora looked at the labeled bags, the legal pad, the postal scale sitting on the concrete. She didn't say anything else that day. But she came back on Sunday. Clara Raines, Amber's grandmother on her father's side, had grown up on a cotton farm in Anson County, about 60 miles east of Gaston, and she understood cotton the way people understand things they grow up inside of. Not as a crop only, as a material, a byproduct system, a set of second and third uses that the textbooks didn't cover because the people who wrote them had not needed to make use of every part of a thing just to get by. Clara died in 2015 when Amber was 12. She left behind a cedar chest, a Singer-Treadle sewing machine, and a composition notebook in which she had written, in a narrow, level hand, notes about cotton farming and processing compiled over decades from her own experience, her mother's experience, and conversations with other cotton farm women across Anson and Union counties. The notebook was not organized by chapter or category. It was organized the way memory is organized, by association, by the order in which things came to her. There were entries about cotton burr compost, about the moisture retention properties of gin mote fiber when used as garden mulch, about how short staple cotton spread at the right depth over clay soil could hold water at 3 to 4 times the rate of pine bark, about using cotton fiber as bedding for small livestock, rabbits, laying hens, pigs in cold weather, about the way a top dressing of cotton motes around tomato plants would suppress soil splash and keep early blight from taking hold before the season found its footing. Clara had not written those things for anyone in particular. She had written them the way a person catalogs what they know when they're not sure who else knows it. Amber had been reading the notebook off and on since she was 13. She had not, until she saw the listing about Belmont Spinning's closure in the Gaston Gazette, thought of it as something with a commercial application. But she had done some research, a few nights on the laptop at the kitchen table, looking up landscaping mulch prices, nursery supply catalogs, organic gardening forums across the Carolinas, and she had found that what Clara had described in plain memory was being sold in specialty markets for prices that the commodity fiber market would have considered laughable. Cotton gin mote mulch, natural cotton fiber garden bedding, short staple cotton fiber as a soil amendment for clay-heavy ground. She found a supplier in Georgia selling processed gin mote bales to organic nurseries for $9.50 per cubic foot. She found another in Texas offering cotton fiber bedding to small animal homesteaders at $14 for a 3 cubic foot bag. She did the math on a sheet of notebook paper, not because she needed to write it down to believe it, but because she'd learned from watching her father that the math written down is the math that holds. A standard gin mote bale in the condition Belmont had stored them, dry, lightly processed, no synthetic treatment, would yield roughly 8 to 10 cubic feet of marketable mulch product after sorting. 600 bales times 9 cubic feet was 5,400 cubic feet. At $9.50 per cubic foot, that was $51,300 in potential gross. Her cost to acquire the bales, if she could negotiate correctly, she hoped to keep under $500. She was 16 years old. She had $1,200 in a savings account she'd built over 2 summers, selling vegetables from a roadside stand on 29A and 6 months of weekend shifts at a hardware store in Belmont. She had a truck, a composition notebook, and 2 unanswered questions: whether Roy Pickett would deal with her, and whether she could find buyers before she ran out of storage room. Neither scared her the way they probably should have. Here is what Amber understood, and what Roy Pickett and the nursery that had offered $400 and the county extension office had no particular reason to think about. Cotton gin motes are not a byproduct in the sense of being left over and meaningless. They're a byproduct in the sense that they fall outside the intended use of the primary operation. The fiber is real. It's clean. Cleaner, in the case of the Belmont Bales, than many alternatives, because the mill had been running raw domestic cotton through older equipment that used no synthetic binders or chemical treatments. The fiber was simply too short for their ring frames. Shortness is a commercial spinning problem. It is not a mulch problem. Cotton fiber mulch holds moisture at a significantly higher rate than pine bark or straw. Some field studies put it at 40 to 60% better retention in clay-heavy soil. It decomposes slowly, adding organic matter over 2 to 3 seasons. It suppresses weeds by blocking light without forming the impermeable mats that plastic mulch creates. Organic nurseries growing in the Carolina Piedmont, with its heavy red clay, paid considerably more for a mulch that worked with their ground rather than against it. Cotton fiber bedding for small livestock, rabbits, laying hens, guinea pigs, miniature goats, was a growing specialty market in the region. It was warm. It compressed well. It was chemical-free in the Belmont Bales. Homesteading communities in Gaston, Lincoln, Mecklenburg, and Cabarrus counties had grown considerably in the previous decade and were buying bedding from out-of-state suppliers and paying the shipping. Her plan was not complicated. Buy the bales cheaply. Sort the cleanest fiber into mulch product. Package it in 2 cubic-foot mesh bags. Sell first to nurseries in Gaston and Lincoln County. Use the first sales to fund packaging for the bedding line. She didn't need a factory. She needed a tarp, a tractor bucket on loan from her father's neighbor, some mesh bags, and a few weekends. She called Roy Pickett Monday morning from the school parking lot during the 10 minutes between buses arriving and first bell. She told him she wanted to make an offer on the bales. He told her he'd had some other expressions of interest over the weekend. She asked what he was looking for. He said he'd need at least $2,000 to make the transaction worth his time, given the paperwork. She said she understood that. She told him she could offer $300 and a liability release waiver she'd had her father's attorney look at over the weekend. Which was true. Her father having a passing relationship with a man named Gerald Pruitt, who handled real estate closings in Bessemer City, and who had reviewed a 1-page document Amber drafted the previous Friday evening. Gerald had not charged her. He had been, if he was honest, mildly stunned that she'd asked. Roy was quiet for a moment. $300, he said. And the liability release, she said, which saves you the county hall fee. Roy Pickett was not a man who enjoyed being outmaneuvered in a conversation he'd thought was already decided. He was also not, at his core, irrational. The bales had been a line item on his disposition report for 11 weeks. The county hall fee, if it came to that, was $1,140. $300 and a clean signature was $300 and a clean signature. I'd need the cash and the paperwork by Friday, he said. I'll have it Thursday, she said. She was in first period English literature 7 minutes later. The money came from her savings account, $300 of the $1,200. She and her father drove to the mill site Thursday at 5 in the afternoon. Roy Pickett was already there. He looked at her father for a moment, not unkindly, just recalibrating again, and then they went through the paperwork. Her father co-signed where required because she was a minor. Roy Pickett folded his copy of the release, put it in his jacket pocket, and shook both their hands. He did not say good luck. He said the next thing closest to it. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, looking at Amber. "I think I do," she said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's run out of argument and isn't quite sure yet what that means. 600 bales. Her bales now. The first Saturday of May, she and her father and Marcus and Dora Hensley, who had arrived at 7 in the morning with work gloves and a thermos of coffee, having decided at some point in the preceding week that she was in, began sorting. They started with the top rows, the driest and cleanest. Amber had sourced mesh packaging bags from an agricultural supply company in Shelby, 200 bags for $88, 2 cubic foot capacity. A borrowed John Deere 4020 from the neighbor with the baling arrangement moved bales without breaking them down by hand. It took 3 weekends to process the first 80 bales into packaged product. She called Briar Creek Nursery in Lincolnton on May 19th. They were her first pitch. She had researched them because they grew perennials in raised beds and had posted twice on a local gardening forum about clay soil drainage. She offered 4 sample bags at no charge. The nursery owner called back in 2 days. She asked for 40 bags. Then she called again and asked for 80. Briar Creek told Carver's Farm and Garden Supply in Stanley, which called Amber the first week of June. A small homesteading co-op in Cabarrus County found her through a post that a forum member had shared. She watched the orders come in and she wrote each one on the same legal pad she'd brought to the mill. By July, she had moved product from 310 of the 600 bales. She had $4,800 in a business checking account her father had helped her open. Under an LLC they formed together. Rains Fiber Co. for $125 through the Secretary of State's office. The waiting list started because she ran out of pre-packaged stock in August. She hadn't expected the bedding line to sell as quickly as the mulch. The homesteading demand was higher than she'd modeled, and she'd modeled carefully. She put up a simple website. She'd describe it later as ugly and functional, which was an honest description, and began taking pre-orders. By September, she had 34 orders on a backlog. She hired her cousin Leah, 17, to help on Saturdays at $10 an hour from the business account. By November, the backlog had grown to 61. She is 17 now. She runs a small but clean operation from a rented space in Cramerton and still drives the F-150 to school. Rains Fiber Co. holds standing wholesale relationships with 3 nurseries in Gaston and Lincoln counties, a recurring order from a poultry hobbyist network in Cabarrus, and a retail waiting list that runs 6 to 8 weeks out on the bedding product. She has 44 bales remaining from the original 600. She is in no particular hurry. She doesn't advertise. She has never needed to. Dora Hensley still shows up on the first Saturday of the month. She brings the thermos. She doesn't explain why she keeps coming back, and nobody has asked her to explain it. She was there the morning Amber processed the last of the cleanest grade, the top row bales with the longest staple moats, the ones her grandmother's notebook had called best for soil application. She watched Amber bag them with the same unhurried attention she brought to every batch, noting the fiber color in her ledger with a pencil, the way she noted everything. The way Clara had noted everything before her. Clara Raines wrote down what she knew, because she wasn't sure who else knew it. Turns out, one person did. What a mill calls garbage and what a person with knowledge calls a resource, sometimes those are the same bale. It just depends on who's standing in front of it.